Hello, everyone. My name. Welcome to the tonight's live author event with Sara Kamali. My name is Stina Björklid. I'm the events manager at the English Bookshop in Uppsala. I am really excited tonight to welcome you to yet another author event in partnership with Bibliotek Uppsala. This pandemic has indeed thrown us a few curveballs, but even though we're not able to host events at the physical bookshops or the library, we're very excited to be able to reach out across the pond. So very much further afield than just Uppsala or Stockholm. And tonight we have Dr. Sara Kamali in California here with us, which is absolutely wonderful. The Bookshop's reading group that normally meet in the shops have also moved online. You can join in wherever you're from, which is absolutely brilliant. And just this week, we have launched a new service, the Book Oracle. This is a way to let you access the in-store experience and take advantage of our expertise. Just give us a few clues of what you like to read, and we give you sort of new books to read. And it's so much fun, and hopefully you like it too. It's more or less playing book wizards, which is great. Just good book wizards doing our magic. And speaking of book wizards, of course, tonight's show is cooperation with Uppsala Stadsbibliotek, which is just across the street from the shop. So whenever you're in Uppsala, please do visit the library, because they're absolute heroes there as well. And they know all there is about books and everything else they need to know in the library. And well, enough of me, because I'm certainly not here to speak tonight. This is just a final reminder for you viewing the live stream, if you do it live, that you can order copies of Sara's book through the link in the live chat and in the video description, and have them personally signed for you if you want to. So please do take advantage of that and order your personally signed books. I'll now hand you over to tonight's author, Dr. Sara Kamali, and the moderator for the evening, Leonidas Aretakis, literary critic at Dagens Nyheter. Please welcome Sara and Leonidas.
Thank you so much.
You go on, please, Sara.
Thank you, Leonidas. Thank you so much to the English Bookshop for having me, and for all of the work you do behind the scenes in putting all of your events together. I very much appreciate your time and your effort, and especially your hospitality. So I'm really delighted to be here today.
So hi guys, and welcome to this talk. Thank you, Stina. I love the word book wizard. I'm sure you are a book wizard as well. So we are all in different places now, isolated, hoping that the pandemic will set us free soon. But today we're going to talk about a different scourge, even though it's an equally global problem, and that is the terror movements of ethnic nationalism and militant Islamism. And in the US, they basically make up together all of the deadly political violence, with 73% of the incidents coming from white nationalists. So the English Bookshop in Uppsala and Uppsala City Library have set up this talk on violent extremism with Sara Kamali, and she has a PhD in religious studies, and her new book, Homegrown Hate, Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War on America, she examines the ideas that drive these movements, their end goals, and how they can best be stopped. So please ask questions about this topic in the chat, and we'll get them from our engineer, Jonas, and we'll get a chance to ask them in the end, I hope. So like we said, my name is Leonidas Aretakis, and this is Sara Kamali. So I'm really glad to have this talk with you.
I'm looking forward to it. And on the topic of questions, I sincerely welcome questions. I know it's for the live chat. I know it's rather late European time, Central European time right now, but your questions are most welcome.
Yes, so let's begin. On January 6th, thousands of Trump supporters protested outside the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and hundreds broke into the building where the Congress members work. And rallying around the false claim that the election was rigged, some protesters even brought weapons with them, with plans for threatening or killing politicians. 400 writers have already been charged, and watching the images, the crowd seemed quite mixed, other than the fact that they were mostly white, but people came from all classes. Some protested taxes and big government, others were dressed like paramilitaries or Nazis. There were conspiracy theories from QAnon, and yet others looked like shamans coming directly from the Burning Man festival. So Sara Kamali, you have been researching this book for a long time before the protests. Were you surprised by the events? And what was your reaction?
Okay, thank you so much. I was not surprised. I actually tweeted about violence around the 2020 election in 2019. So about 11 months prior, I was tweeting and I said, well, you know, the election will most likely incite some type of violence. Of course, nobody can predict anything, from my opinion, and certainly not the attack on democracy that was the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. But it is interesting that you said how diverse, how seemingly disparate the groups and the representation of the attackers were, because that really speaks to the way that I conceptualize white nationalism in the book. Now, of course, we use a lot of different terms around the world in order to describe people who believe there is something inherent, there is a white race and there's something inherently biologically and culturally superior. The white race has inherent biological and cultural superiority. But the way that I categorize white nationalism in my book, Homegrown Hate, is that they are anti-government, they are racist, they are religiously racist, and they are also of conspiracy theory oriented. And of course, that doesn't mean that one white nationalist has all four elements, but that within the ideology of white nationalism, there are those categories and amalgamation thereof. So what we saw at the Capitol was very much a calling of not only the support of the presidency of Donald Trump and essentially his anti-government racist, religiously racist, essentially, and conspiracy theory rhetoric, as well as xenophobic policies, but also by proxy of supporting Donald Trump and wanting to reinstate him as president of the United States. Also a call for the United States to be a white ethno-state. And so it's really interesting that throughout his presidency, and of course for decades and even centuries prior to the United States, to his presidency, and the history of the United States really lends itself to understanding the need for the country to be a white ethno-state. So that's where the term white nationalism comes in.
All right, so we're going to dig deeper into the book in just a moment. I wanted to bring up a Swedish movement that's quite similar, because when we saw what happened at the Capitol, it was like a lot of people here were actually surprised. But now, you know, there's a similar movement here that's called Frihetsrörelsen, the freedom movement, and it combines, you know, again, a lot of different things. It is COVID denial, it's 5G. Conspiracy theories about globalists, wellness, New Age, the sovereign citizen movement, which doesn't believe in any government, and entrepreneurialism, and just to mention a few ideas. And they had 2 demonstrations in Stockholm, and just a few hundred turned up, and people made kind of fun of them. But our Breitbart-esque media, the right-wing press, they love them, and they cover their launch of an all-male defense wing now, which is the latest development. So it has anti-Semitic and racist aspects, but the people there, I don't know. It is. I think that most don't really believe in an ethno-state. Like, they just seem confused and maybe lonely, and a couple of militants are holding them together. Am I being naive in that analysis?
So what makes you say that they don't really believe in an ethno-state?
Because it's just so recently brought together, and it seems like they don't really fit together or know each other. People come from all places in the country and travel into Stockholm, and you know, they have the signs are totally different messages. You know, most people just don't believe in like the mainstream media. That's also another thing. But it isn't really that racial for all of them at the moment. It could become that. How would you analyze a movement like that? Do you think I'm naive?
Oh, I wouldn't say you're naive. I would say that certainly it's not that they don't fit together. I think that actually speaks to the power of the white nationalist ideology, in that it attracts so many seemingly disparate followers. But really, there is a power to the narrative that there are forces bigger than oneself that are dangerous, and really that's what conspiracy theories rely on. And it's interesting too that many of the same beliefs in conspiracy theories are actually transnational. So that's another aspect I discuss in the book, of course, where white nationalism is transnational. And really, I'm saying that because QAnon, which has been described as a religion or a pseudo religion by some, has taken up so much traction during and after the presidency of Donald Trump. And so we're seeing the prevalence of not only disinformation, but also of the belief in conspiracy theories, such as 5G is harmful, one shouldn't have the coronavirus vaccine, the prevalence of the belief in Q, for example, around the world. So I would say that it's not necessarily that these people don't fit together. It's that the attraction of the white nationalist ideology is perhaps it's perhaps attracting them from a different angle than a white ethno-state. But it's interesting too, because I would really like to engage with them and have conversations with them, because otherwise we're not going to necessarily understand their worldviews. But it would be interesting to see, because the way that I also discuss white nationalism is that it's a natural extension of the belief that there's something inherently superior in the white race. And so many of these people are white, and if one believes in white supremacy, essentially, no matter where one is in the world, then the natural extension of that is to have a state of one's own, a territory of one's own. And that goes back to the European concept of blood and soil.
So I'm wondering about the scope of that concept, because the book is partly on white nationalism and partly on militant Islamism. So white nationalism, I'm wondering about how broad that concept is. Is Donald Trump a white nationalist? Are his voters that? Is the Republican Party a white nationalist party? And is the US a white nationalist country? Do you see what I'm getting at? I mean, how wide a net does that concept constitute?
Well, it's transnational for a reason. And so in the United States, there's been recently, of course, recently it's become more public, but it's a long-standing debate over, is America a racist country, etc. But we can perhaps reframe the question to say that, are the institutions of the United States, for example, do they exploit the concept of race to maintain power? And so that's really what racism is the exploitation of the erroneous concept of race in order to enact real power differential dynamics. And essentially that results in an oppression of people. And of course, privilege of a few people, white race, essentially. So,
all right.
So
that means that in non-white countries, the movement is entirely different. I mean, countries like the Philippines, for example.
Or India, for example.
India, Modi, yes, right. Exactly.
Right. So there's certainly the concept of the ethno-nationalism. And I think that when we talk about the universality of Leonidas, can you see me?
I can see you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what happened. But when we speak about the universality of the concept of white nationalism, what can be translated particularly to territories that are not predicated upon a certain white identity, or that the landmass needs to be a white ethno-state. What is the common denominator is the concept of ethno-nationalism. So there's something inherently superior about a specific group of people, and that superiority and that supremacy is what determines the right, or what bestows the right to govern the country and also populate it.
Mm-hmm. And because the book is mostly about these, I mean, there are Nazi movements, there's the Odinism and Waltonism. Maybe we could just get into that right now, because I'm in Norse territory right now. So I was quite surprised as well that it was a, I don't know, quite strong movement in the US. Can't you say something about that faith and the role in the wider nationalist movement in the US? And how many Asatru adherents are there in the US?
Yeah, so thank you so much for bringing that up. Now, I want to be very specific that when, like with any type of militant expression of any religion, I make very clear that that's not the only interpretation of the religion. And I also discuss in the conclusion as well the different movements which are focusing on the peaceful expressions and the interfaith expressions. So there's a lot of work being done by Odinists, by Christians, by Muslims around the world, by Jews around the world, to say that, well, our religions are not actually violent, nor do they support militancy. But of course, the book is about militants and people who would wage political violence in the name of beliefs. So it's interesting that you bring up Asatru, because well, in the before time, so before the pandemic, there was a Hof here in the Midwest in the United States that gained quite a lot of publicity because it was established, and it gained a lot of followers, actually. And there was quite a debate over its racist tenets, essentially, and the exclusion of certain people who were not allowed to join. But then, well, there were a lot of other things going on in the media at the time, so that story was kind of left behind. But of course, it is very interesting, because there's also the concept that there are certain interpretations of Odinism, for example, that speak to the United States being a territory meant to be a white ethno-state. So when we think about white nationalism and how various religions are supportive of the white race in a white territory, it's not just specific interpretations of Christianity, like Christian identity or white nationalist evangelicalism. That notion is also quite prevalent amongst other world religions that are adhered to quite broadly. So thank you so much for bringing that up. How does the concept? Oh, I would like to ask you, from your experience, how does the concept of white identity play out in the ground from your understanding? You know, based on perhaps your experiences or your interactions with Odinists, or interpretations of Norse religions, because I've also, I do discuss that in the book, but I'd like to know from experiences.
I don't really. I mean, there is this. These symbols can be interpreted as far right symbols. If you see it on a tattoo, etc. So there is this. We have it here as well. This radical interpretation of Odinism, and how many there are. Adherents of Odinism as well that are not militant, but I don't know. It's not a huge movement, to be honest. So
yeah, it's actually interesting too that so in the 1960s and the 50s, it was the Nation of Islam that was one of the fastest growing religions in the carceral system. So within prisons, that was the religion to watch out for in terms of militarization. But most recently, in the past decade, if not longer, it's actually been Odinism and Wotanism. And so the Supreme Court, at some point in the early 21st century, the Supreme Court actually allowed Thor's hammer to be an accepted symbol that can be worn by people who are incarcerated in prison. And so it's interesting to see how much traction that has gained. And I think if I can just jump for a second, talking about runes and tattoos and symbols, is that if we look at how Odinist runes, for example, have been utilized within the United States as well as around the world, we can see that the trajectory of utilization has also been parallel with the normalization of white nationalist ideology. So before, it was very much if one shaved one's head and wore military boots, for example, that was a very particular brand of white nationalism. When, you know, being a skinhead really spoke to, okay, I'm a white nationalist. But now we've seen that, or even, of course, the swastika from Nazi Germany being utilized in that way. But now it's much more subdued and much more, well, normalized, essentially, in terms of being able to use runes, etc., to symbolize white nationalism. So it's no longer an overt representation, but I think a lot of these things are not necessarily covert, but very much part and parcel of every day. So even if you look at, for example, the portraits of people from January 6th, of course, there was the shaman, but most people, you wouldn't necessarily, they look probably like most people one encounters every day on the street. I mean, now we're all wearing masks, but it's this kind of sense that, well, the face of a terrorist has changed. And it's not that terrorism itself has changed, it's that the January 6th has really forced many people to reconceptualize who is a terrorist.
So the book is also about militant Islamism. Let's move over there for a minute. Why did you want to compare these two movements?
Yeah, so sometimes when people ask me that, the initial response I have is why not? But I realize that sounds rather glib, and I don't intend it to be glib. Why that kind of...
What is similar and what is different about them?
Well, you know, what's interesting too is that I think I was the last generation perhaps to grow up in the specter of, to remember what life was like very briefly before 9/11. And so it was really interesting. Well, of course, now we have January 6th, but post 9/11, there was a lot of rhetoric about Islam and the real Islam and the good Muslim versus bad Muslim trope, etc. And then knowing that, well, growing up with that, and then knowing the history of the KKK, for example, and of the Oklahoma City bombing, which is the deadliest terrorist attack to date on U.S. soil, perpetrated by an American citizen, killed 168 people, and it was the bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City, and that was perpetrated in 1995 by Timothy McVeigh, who was a U.S. Army veteran and a white man. And so having these seeming dichotomies between narratives, again, of who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist, really prompted me to explore from a comparative lens what essentially would become the book. And so really I started the book maybe even more than, you know, a decade now of thought, but I think it's a fusion of my personal experiences as well as my, you know, academic professional trajectory as well. So if we talk about similarities, we can see that there are parallels in terms of the narratives of victimhood that is very specific to white nationalist ideology as well as militant Islamist ideology. And so, of course,
they both see themselves as victims of something.
Right.
So the militant Islamists see themselves as a victim of what?
U.S. foreign policy.
All right.
And so
white nationalists. And the white nationalists, why do they see themselves as victims then?
Immigrants, people of color, and essentially that forces the state to act against their best interests. And so we see that the changing demographics as well in the United States, as well as the influx of immigrants post many of the wars, for example, we're still conflict zones, but the influx of immigrants, migrants, and refugees, for example, coming into Europe from Syria, have also exacerbated a lot of the tensions within communities, but also the xenophobic rhetoric, and that's really what the political far right has latched on. Of course, we're seeing that a lot in France as well, and many European countries have seen an increase in the support for political far right parties and politicians. Yeah.
So the idea is that the demographic is changing rapidly, and that there is white genocide or exchange of peoples, or whatever the term is.
And the economic threats, and so basically cultural identity, economic anxiety. But that's not; these are all play into the narrative of there's a white genocide happening, and the white people numerically as well as culturally are under threat of extinction.
Yeah, and both sides see a war going on between civilizations, right? So that's maybe also something they have in common. So, but what are the differences then?
Well, I think certainly the demographics, and not in terms of gender, but in terms of religiosity and the way that religions are exploited is a primary difference. And that kind of nuance is not something that is necessarily it doesn't necessarily lend itself to today's media climate where everything is in sound bites or in 140 character tweet. But there's a whole array of religions within the constellation of white nationalism. And so we mentioned a few before. And I think it's really interesting too, there doesn't necessarily have to be religion within white nationalism. The 14 words, for example, is enough, or, the 14 words.
What are the 14 words?
So the 14 words is a phrase penned in 1988 by David Lane, who was actually, he founded Wotanism. And that idea, as I argue in the book, is something that has been prevalent even before David Lane. So he really articulated the concept of white genocide, which is again a prevalent theme throughout white nationalist ideology. And the most prominent version of the 14 words is, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." So not only does that speak to the inherent aspect of militancy within white nationalism, that we must secure the existence of our people, but it also speaks to the inherent supremacy and racism, so our people, and the future for white children. Also, I think speaks to the misogyny as well, because there are women who have been very supportive of various facets of white nationalism throughout the centuries across the world. And for example, one of the most prominent women who has really promoted white nationalism within prisons is Elsa Christensen, for example. But women are also targeted as by virtue of the fact that they're seen as less than, while they're also used as vessels for procreation of the white race. So that's another interesting dynamic.
And that's also pretty similar in the two movements, right? The role of the women in there.
Yes, yeah.
So the book it's called Homegrown Hate, and I wonder what makes you see Islamism as homegrown. Like many of these movements had the roots in the the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s, etc., the Saudi regime. The Muslim Brotherhood goes even further back. So your focus is on post 9/11 terrorism. How do you see? Why do you see it as a homegrown, like a homegrown product of the United States?
So I focus on how citizens themselves, whether they're naturalized or by birth, essentially view their country of citizenship, and why they are waging violence against it. Why do they see their country as an enemy, essentially? So it's interesting that you bring up that, because if we go back far enough, well, the religious concepts, for example, that underline white nationalism, even within the United States, can be seen to be imports. So I think that's another interesting thing to bring up as well, because Islam is often the religion of Islam, not militant Islamism. The religion of Islam, which has a variety of expressions, and 2 billion people around the world are adhering to this, to one religion. It's often seen as other than. So even when we're not talking about a white ethno-state, for example, in India, for example, in Myanmar, Muslims themselves are often seen as less than, as other, as not belonging to the territory. So I think the question about how can militant Islamists be a homegrown phenomenon, the question itself perhaps speaks to the othering of Muslims themselves, not militant Islamists, but of Muslims themselves.
Not really. I'm just saying that maybe, it has a different geographical origin, I guess. I mean, you could argue that the U.S. were involved in many of these wars, of course,
yes,
in everything that I mentioned, basically. But yeah, that was just what I was wondering. So, because you call them homegrown, so
yes, yeah, and I think that's interesting too. Just to go back to your question about differences, is that when we speak about militant Islamists, the platform that they have in terms of or the array of grievances that they have in terms of using US-led wars in Muslim-majority countries and to propagandize their violence, to justify their violence, to call for supporters, to promote their organizations, are also appealing to people. People can see perhaps that U.S.-led wars in countries like Afghanistan, which is now, of course, the U.S. is trying to pull out from, how much damage that has wrought, both for troops in the country as well as civilians themselves. So, in terms of differences, I think also the platform by white nationalists is very easy to say, well, I don't believe that. But I think there's a finer delineation between the platform of militant Islamists and many Muslims and non-Muslims around the world. That being said, however, the point is that militant Islamists wage war and violence in the name of political aims, and the people who think that the U.S.-led wars in Muslim-majority countries are wrong, they're not going to wage war against the United States. So I want to be very clear about those differentiations.
So based on your research, because the book is also kind of prescriptive,
okay. Yep.
What do you think that Western governments have done right and wrong in combating terrorism? And what would you propose to change if you could?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd sincerely love to hear your thoughts about how you see the prescriptions in terms of the context of where you are currently. There are so many things that need to be changed. And the reason I'm saying that is because we were speaking previously about this, but currently the counterterrorism paradigm in the United States, as it is in the UK, as it is in many parts of the world, was really set up post 9/11 and since 9/11. So really as a response to militant Islamism. Now, it has been completely ineffective within the context of the United States specifically, not only because there have not been cases of that many cases, I should say, in comparison to white nationalism, of militant Islamist violence, so of that homegrown militant Islamist terrorism.
Isn't that a success?
Oh, well, that's
I'm sorry for asking a provocative question, but
No,
I agree that there is the Patriot Act, etc. It has placed a lot of Muslims, of course, that are totally innocent, has affected them and their lives. But that's like one question. But the other question is, hasn't the counterterrorism policies stopped violence? I mean, you say, there haven't been that many incidents. Mm-hmm. So how do you balance security and freedom is, the overarching question, and this is the case.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So the tactics that have been used in order to procure cases, in order to indict cases, in order to charge people, in order to prosecute cases, the tactics have been quite legally slippery. In that there has been evidence over the past 2 decades that has shown the majority of the cases, not all of the cases, as I discussed in the book, there have been some valid cases that have been prevented because of this type of Patriot Act surveillance. But the majority of cases have been through tactics that use entrapment, that use agent provocateurs, that prey on people, Muslims who have mental health issues. So there's been a whole slew of civil rights issues when it comes to militant Islamist, supposedly militant Islamist cases. Those same types of issues actually have been utilized to infiltrate white nationalist groups in the 70s and 80s. So it's not just like these tactics were singularly used against Muslim Americans, but they were very much more prevalent post 9/11 than they were before. And really, we can see, if we're going to talk about efficacy of U.S. counterterrorism specifically, we can see that it hasn't been effective, because if it had been effective, then January 6th would never have happened.
All right, thanks. I want to talk a bit about France, and there's been a lot of talk there of, because your research also has this activist approach, I guess. You call it empathy-based, the empathy-based counterterrorism paradigm, and also anti-oppression, right? Anti-oppression and
holistic justice.
Yes, right. Yes.
The do something approach.
yeah, the do something approach. And in France, there is this, I don't know how that plays into that debate, but I just know about France. And there's been a talk about this Islam-friendly left on the universities that is too soft on militant Islamism, that has too much empathy for them, that is willing to explain away any violence as an answer to, police brutality, imperialist wars, Islamophobia, etc. And that these same arguments are used by the Islamists themselves. So even the Macron government has made these claims and called out Islamophobic So you call for an empathetic approach in your book. What do you make of that debate and that argument?
The debate that too much empathy basically lets militant Islamists off the hook.
Yes.
I would say, well, of course, every country has its own unique dynamics with its own many community groups. And there have, of course, been many tensions between Muslims in particular, as well as non-Muslims in France. So the very concept of identity, for example, and citizenship are contested when it comes to practicing Islam in France, as it has in many parts of the world. Again, that goes back to what I said earlier, is that when Muslims are often no matter what part of the world, Muslims are often thought of as other and not citizens. But I would say that the platform of the platform that says that that the left is too soft on militant Islamists is politically convenient for the right, and that's something that actually has parallels to the current debates, for example, on whether or not systemic racism exists in the United States and communities of color in the United States, and any community that is considered less than. And so there's a reason that the political far right in many countries, and as we discussed earlier in Europe, for example, continentally, has given rise. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of xenophobia, particularly during economic crises, equates political success for the political far right.
Yeah. So it's an argumentative book, and which I like. And some of its ideas are quite debated right now. And before we let the audience in, so I'm going to ask you another. I'm going to come at you from another angle, but not from the right, but from the left, maybe, because you mentioned Robin DiAngelo's idea of white fragility in the book, and that book was just translated into Swedish, so we have kind of have that debate here as well. And the idea of white fragility is that white people are too sensitive to listen. Feel free to correct me, of course. Too sensitive to listen to other voices about racism, which makes the conversation difficult. And you write that white fragility has hindered many white people from realizing their unearned privileged position within society, and that white people are arguably have the most agency to make significant change. And so, if I understand you correctly, in your counter-terrorism approach,
justice, right?
The better off should show empathy with people who are victimized, like both rural poor whites, I guess, and Muslims suffering from racism and Islamophobia. And a worry that I have when I read that is that it sounds like the main agent for change in that theory is white liberals, and not really the oppressed themselves. Like that political victories are not won hard from below, but handed over from the enlightened above. I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding you, but please.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify and the questions and really the thoughtfulness behind them. So thank you so much. Okay, so a few things. One is that Robin DiAngelo, her other primary argument is that all white people are racist, whether they agree with that or not. And by racist, essentially is upholding the institution of the white privilege throughout institutions. I would perhaps word that differently. And so maybe there's a room for disagreement there, which I note. You have to look at the notes, however, in the book. The other thing, just, so many pages can be published. The other thing, too, is that I do appreciate your conceptualization of top-down and down-up approach in terms of who has agency to make change. And so that's why there are several components of holistic justice, which is the prescription for an effective counterterrorism policy. One is, of course, dismantling and redoing the current paradigm and instituting something I call holistic justice, which is really predicated upon reconfiguring the USA Patriot Act, for one. But then also the concept that you talk about of empathy, which is essentially getting to know one's own identities, getting to know other people's identities within the context of where you live. And so perhaps like we're seeing right now with the debate over critical race theory, the debate over whether or not systemic racism exists, the debate over citizenship, identity, and belonging in very many European countries, for example, that charge can most definitely be led by white liberals who would seek to make change and who speak about equity and equality and who have the political leverage. There's also the concept equally important to holistic justice, which I call anti-oppression. And that most definitely centers upon the solidarity of people of color, of the historically marginalized, not only across identities of skin color, but also faith communities, and also advocates, for example, of mental health resources, of gun control, of big tech, for example, and social media and online hate. So there's a whole amalgamation. So what's equally important, as you kind of pointed out, is that not only does there have to be a top-down approach in terms of policy, there also has to be an equally functioning approach from the grassroots up that mobilizes that change as well. So I wouldn't say that the onus is on one particular skin color group or one particular identity group than the other. I would say that they're equally important, but they each have perhaps different roles to play.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much. I wanted to get in some comments now, and I'm gonna one question comes from Nicholas, and I'm gonna develop a little on that question, because I wanted to ask something similar. So I'll put them together, and I'm sorry, Nicholas, if I ruin your question, but you write in the book that militant Islamists in the U.S., that they have little knowledge of Islam, and that's been shown also by Swedes who go to fight for jihad. So the same probably goes for a lot of white nationalists, at least here in Sweden. Their Christianity doesn't seem that sincere. So what I wonder is, why then focus on ideology so much? Like 50 years ago, I guess the same people might have joined the RIF or the Californian death cult or something. So why not focus on like social factors that push individuals to reach out to these violent ideologies in the first place, especially if the aim is to contribute to an effective counterterrorism strategy? And Nicholas' comment was something in the same line. It was, why don't we treat white nationalism or ethnic nationalism as male mental health problem?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And that is certainly something that I just touched upon with the anti-oppression aspect of counterterrorism. I also discussed that in the introduction as well, in terms of the resources that are needed in order to counter terrorism, but also in terms of how very often white nationalists are perceived as having mental health problems. So there is that disparity in terms of narrative. In terms of why shouldn't white nationalists or ethnic nationalists be diagnosed with mental health problems rather than, deemed to be terrorists? Well, I would say that, in fact, many of the white nationalist cases specifically are actually viewed through the lens of mental health, whereas militant Islamists don't have that privilege. And I'm not saying that's a right. I'm just saying that that's not the lens that the media is seeing these cases. But I would also argue, and I do that as well, that definitely there needs to be a focus on public health as well as the psychosocial dynamics. So what prompts one to take action and violent action at that in the pursuit of political aims is perhaps never going to be known, because there's not this formula or this specific algorithm that is going to apply to every single individual case. But what we can say is that mental health resources are very much underfunded in the United States, and that there definitely needs to be a mental health component. So I think, Nicholas, you're that's an astute observation and a very real concern, and an absolutely essential part to any effective counterterrorism policy. So where that fits within holistic justice would be in that anti-oppression pillar. So we have empathy and anti-oppression, and the anti-oppression pillar would definitely be a place where mental health resources would be advocated for, where grassroots movements would perhaps address those services as well. Ideally, of course, that would come from the top down, but given how much needs to be restructured, I think it's perhaps more feasible to have that from the local organizations.
So I thought I would do the same thing with another question, which comes from Petter. So his question is, what do you think of politicization of counterterrorism more widely? Given a shift to a more empathetic policy, wouldn't you expect huge pushback from the right? I actually have an actual example of that. Would you like to answer, and then we can get into the to my example? Did you get his question?
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for that. That's another wonderfully astute and insightful question. So most definitely. I mean, for example, in the United States, that we cannot even agree on whether or not there's systemic racism. That's not to whether or not racism has been the socio-historical and political phenomenon has been leveraged to wage oppression as well as grant privilege to certain people. So there's not even consensus about that. So most definitely, I would expect a huge pushback from the political far right, especially when it comes to, well, really disassembling and then redoing our current counterterrorism paradigm, which very much needs to be done if we're going to have an effective strategy to counter the current threats.
So there is a really actual example of this. I don't know if you've seen the recruitment video for the CIA. It's very recent. Did you watch it? I encourage people listening to watch that recruitment video because it sparked some debate, some pushback from the right, you could say. So, yes. And also from the left, of course. And it's a non-white woman. This is from my memory now, but non-white woman. She speaks this poetic spoken word manner. It's almost rhyme, but it has this, this
lyrical quality,
rhythm. Yes, exactly, lyrical quality. Thank you. And she says things like, "I'm intersectional," and she's walking around and just talking about how she got where she got, her struggles and everything. She even has a second wave feminist T-shirt on. So there's a feminist symbol with a clenched fist. So I don't know, is this an example of your empathetic counterterrorism approach, or what do you make of the video?
Well, my empathetic counterterrorism approach would have to restructure the policy and the priorities of the FBI and CIA and departments. So the
video is not enough. Is that what you're saying?
No, that really. That is perhaps more tokenistic than actual substantive change. So until policies are actually shifted, until priorities are shifted, until there's, until a lot of changes are made, then a simple video with a T-shirt activism, I call it, is not going to be enough.
All right, but it could signal a shift in values and priorities, do you think?
Well, there's signaling and then there's doing. So,
yeah. So this kind of brings us to another debate, and I'm not sure where you stand there, but I mean, I'm thinking, like, how is it impossible for the CIA to make such a video if the BLM movement, which I think it alludes to a lot, and these critical race theory debates, it kind of takes a stand for one side there. And I wonder, like, if the U.S. state is a white nationalist state.
What do you mean by that, though? It is a white
that it's foundationally racist. I mean, my take on this critical race theory debate is that after the civil rights movement, they had a few successes, but in the 70s and 80s, I feel like a lot of people were still, depressed by the results. Like, we're still not really free. People are still poor and struggling. And critical race theory, from what I understand, it grew from these legal battles. And like, the legal battles are not enough. Racism goes beyond that. It's part of the fabric of American society. And that's so that's one analysis of what not went wrong, but why the civil rights movement didn't go far enough, perhaps, or didn't succeed in liberating its black populations. And the other one is more of a class argument, like it didn't go far enough because it's not enough to be free just legally. You also need to have the means, you know, you have to have housing, etc. So these are, I guess, two different approaches, you know. So I'm wondering, like, how can, like, the CIA and Jeff Bezos even he donated, you know, millions to Black Lives Matter and NAACP. How is it possible for them to do that if they see that movement as a threat? Like,
well, I can't speak to them, and I don't know if they see that movement necessarily as a threat.
But he's the most powerful white man in the U.S. You know, he crushed the unions, but he donates to BLM. I mean, why does he have that? How does it work? Why does he have that? Like, how can you do that if that would be a threat to his power? Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
That's kind of a. I guess I made the right wing argument just a few minutes ago, so now I'm making the left wing argument. Like, how much can white nationalism explain? White nationalism, that concept, explain what the most powerful in the U.S., like what their aims are and what their power is built on.
Well, certainly.
The question is weird. Is it too complicated a question? Is the unclear question?
No, it's well. I'll respond, and then you can maybe ask a follow-up. How does that sound? Yeah. Okay. So if we look at who the richest people in the United States are, which are, well, in the United States, they're all going to be. I mean, maybe if we look at the top 5 richest people, and of course Jeff Bezos, his wealth will encompass a lot of other people on that list. Well, the wealth of other people on that list. So I would say that being a white man in this country is certainly grants one inherent privilege, and I think that speaks to that.
All right.
So what's your follow-up question?
No, I didn't actually have a follow-up question. I mean, you get into this topic, which is kind of a debate within the U.S. left, I guess, the Democratic Party. Like, is it race or is it class? And of course, everyone is going to say it's both, I guess. But there's still a shift. There's still a dynamic where you can lean on either leg, and you bring that up in relation to counterterrorism, right? Which is why would you agree that is a debate also within counterterrorism circles, or is it more of a media debate? Because you bring up these concepts and you write that race is the central oppression in the United States, and the other oppressions are racism, below them, where I guess class is
interlocking with them. So if there's a central axis of oppression, it's going to be racism. So essentially, the darker one's skin, the less privilege one has. I mean, and there's also colorism within communities as well. And then, of course, I mean, we can see that the intersections of identities, for example, again, the darker one's skin, the less privilege one has. So in terms of, well, I think that power dynamic really plays out in terms of white nationalism specifically, and how again racism is leveraged.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask you something about like what's ahead of us now, and I wanted to end on that note as well. Like Biden has won. And now it feels like Trump has, been, there is not much talk about him now. He's not on Twitter, thankfully. And what does that make? What consequences does it have make for the movement, for the white nationalist movement? Are they weakened by that? Are they regrouping? So what can we expect, and what are we seeing right now?
So I think it was just yesterday, and of course this will be played, live in perpetuity on the internet. But today is May 5th, so I think it was just yesterday that former President Donald Trump launched some type of communication site on his website. So there's some type of way to communicate and interact with him. I think he posted a video banner video, and then I'm not sure if he's directly interacting with people. But there is some type of thing where he's subverting his ban, essentially his Facebook ban and his Twitter ban. So he's still very much active. Of course, we have yet to see if he will run in 2024. But in terms of the fact that he's no longer president, whether or not that weakens, white nationalists, the white nationalists' ability to group and the propaganda, etc. I would say no, because if we look at the history of white nationalism, that Donald Trump certainly harnessed the platforms and the grievances, but he in no way, he was not. He really harnessed that platform for political gain. And so he's definitely going to be part of the political framework in the political far right, and in terms of harnessing the white nationalist platform for political gain. But he's certainly not going to be the last person to do so, and it's certainly not the ending of the tenure of Donald Trump.
Do you think that Tucker Carlson will step up, or?
Well, I think he is already very much stepping up, and not only have we seen that in terms of how. In terms of in terms of how essentially virulent he's being, it sounds honestly like he's running for president now, and I know that he's perhaps somewhat interested in doing so in 2024. But really, we can see that the expansion of his platform. So he was recently, just this past, I think earlier in 2021, he was had a new multi-year contract that. Where he's now not only doing his nightly show, but also on podcasts. There's also going to be monthly specials. And so his viewership is certainly on the increase. And really, he's the central focal point for Fox News. And he has his platform has greatly expanded as well. So whether or not he runs for president, of course, again, I said earlier too that human beings cannot predict anything. But I think in terms of harnessing, again, the platform of hate, he's doing a very good job of that. And subsequently, or in addition to that, the media as well of different biases is doing a good job of also covering that and giving him that coverage.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for this talk, and congratulations on the book. It was a great read, very thorough, very thoughtful. It woke. I got a lot of thoughts from it, as you can hear. So that was great. So thank you so much for this, and good luck in the future.
Thank you so much, Leonidas. I truly appreciated the thoughtfulness of your questions, and thank you so much for the to the people who asked questions. Thank you for your time.
And thank you so much, both Sara and Leonidas, and all of the audience, of course.
The book wizard. Popping up.
Well, we should thank the tech wizard for making all this possible, of course.
Yeah. Maybe he can predict the future. I don't know. Sorry for interrupting you.
And to you in the audience, remember you're always also welcome to contact the Bookshop as well as the library for any reading recommendations on similar subjects as tonight's topic or any other. And remember to check out the new Bookshop's new service, the Book Oracle. We're very proud of that. As well as the book club and, of course, our reading groups at bookshop.se. And we have so many things to look forward to. This is absolutely amazing. Next week, May 12th, we meet up with YA author David Levithan. Absolutely wonderful author. And on Monday, 17th of May, we're very, very excited to have an event with crime writer Anne Cleves. Don't miss that. And on June 3rd, we'll meet up with fantasy author Victoria Aveyard, who's written the best-selling Red Queen series. We're absolutely chuffed to have the ability or the opportunity to do all this. So at least that's sort of the flip side to the pandemic. But thank you so much for tonight, and stay tuned on bookshop.se and bibliotekupsala.se. And see you soon again. Bye-bye.
See you.